Greetings, all you movie junkies and entertainment lovers, and welcome to this very special Halloween review. Today we're going to be taking a look at Halloween 20 years later, or it's most commonly known as Halloween H20. For those of you who are perhaps not that familiar with the Halloween franchise, let me give you a quick history lesson on how we ended up with this movie in the first place. The original Halloween, of course, originally came out in 1978 and would become one of the most influential and successful horror films of its day. And then it would eventually go on to become one of the most well-known iconic horror films of all time. It spawned multiple sequels, the first of which was the almost equally successful Halloween 2 in 1981, which had the involvement of the original creators Deborah Hill and of course John Carpenter, and focused on the return of Michael Myers and taking place on the exact same night in 1978. After that, we got Halloween 3's Season of the Witch, which did not have Laurie Strode, Michael Myers, or anything to do with the previous two movies. Halloween 3 was an attempt to take the franchise in an anthology direction, with each film focusing on a different horror story taking place at Halloween. Pretty great idea that unfortunately at the time was not well received by audiences. So, a couple of years later, they brought Michael Myers back in Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. This time, it would not have the involvement of the original creators, nor would it have Jamie Lee Curtis return. Instead, it would focus on Laurie's daughter, Jamie, played by Danielle Harris, of which the next two films would also focus on, of which were Halloween 5, The Revenge of Michael Myers, and Halloween 6, The Curse of Michael Myers, both of which had a lot of production problems and were not as well received as Halloween 4. So by the time they got to Halloween 6, Jamie Lee Curtis herself was interested in returning, and thus we got Halloween 20 years later. This film acting as a soft reboot, ignoring the three previous sequels, called 20 Years Later, as you can imagine, takes place 2 decades after Laurie survived the massacre on October 31st, 1978. Laurie now works as a headmistress of a private school in Northern California. However, despite her new lifestyle, she is constantly finding herself hunted and persisted by the past. Especially with it being Halloween, she is constantly afraid of the return of her brother Michael. This time, Michael does come back, who soon discovers her whereabouts and descends upon Laurie's peaceful community, and a feeling of dread weighs upon her with good reason. However, when Laurie discovers that Michael has come back this time, she will not be running away. This film, of course, came out 2 years after Scream and actually had the involvement of the writer of Scream, Kevin Williamson. When you watch this movie, it feels in many ways a lot more like a Scream movie than it does a Halloween movie. I would honestly personally argue that the overall look and tone of the film, it does actually fit and look a lot more like the first two Halloween movies than the other previous sequels. Where the Scream aspect comes into it, I think is a big part of the music, and some of the music was actually composed by Marco Beltrami, who of course actually did the music for the first couple of Scream films. That tone with the music, I think, is very much really the only thing that I would say really makes it like a Scream film, other than just being made in that era. Personally, I don't actually mind the slight change in tone. One of the big things that the Halloween franchises, as well as many other horror franchises, are normally criticized for is being, just kind of repeating themselves, and the sequels not really having any good reason for existing. I have, watched all of these movies a dozen times. I can say that honestly I have become much more fond of Halloween H2O over the years. In a weird way, I actually do kind of like that this film has its own signature tone and look to it that kind of, in a way, when you watch the other movies, kind of makes it have a breath of fresh air compared to the other films. So, whereas a lot of people criticize it for not being the same, that's what I appreciate about it, the fact that it's not just a complete repeat, that they tried to update it for what at that time was a more modern era. And as somebody who's a huge fan of the Scream franchise, honestly, I don't really mind it too much. The music itself, it was originally composed by John Ottman, who is a great composer. The initial title music is fantastic, a really cool orchestrated version of the Halloween theme, which I know is a bit hit and miss with people. Some people really dig it, other people really don't. For me personally, as this being, 20 years later, bringing back Jamie Lee Curtis, new orchestrated version of the theme for, this movie, I thought was great, and I've always absolutely loved that orchestrated version of the main theme. However, a lot of Ottman's other music in the film A lot of the people who are involved with the movie will agree it didn't quite fit with the tone and feel of Halloween, which is why they later brought in Marco Beltrami, who of course had done the music for the first two Scream movies at the time, very much giving it that Scream feel. The final result of the movie is a mix between some music by John Ottman and some music by Marco Beltrami. Other people's issues with the film, one thing that is not going to be everyone's cup of tea is the jump scares. There's a lot of fake out jump scares in particular in this movie. I don't really have much issue with it. I think in a way that it's kind of fitting because we as the audience know right from the opening that Michael is on his way. But Laurie of course has no idea. She's been very paranoid about it because of the time of year that it is, and we see that particularly in the first half of the movie. I do really enjoy a lot of the sort of stuff with her seeing him in the reflection of the windows and stuff. I think that aspect of it is pretty interesting and keeps you on the edge of your seat because you're kind of wondering, oh shoot, is that him? Is he there? We get that part with Michelle Williams' character seeing him outside the school, and that's kind of our first indicator because she of course has never met Michael, so that says to us, the audience, that oh, he's there now. The other jump scares a lot with, other people kind of bumping into her. Perhaps, I will admit, maybe it's a little bit one too many, but it's honestly to the point where it's kind of funny in a way. One of the jump scares, of course, being Janet Leigh, Jamie Lee Curtis's real life mother. Actual character name is Norma, and the first thing that that she's saying is she's complaining about that there's been issues with the drainage in the girls' shower room being clogged, of course being a reference to the infamous shower scene in Psycho. And then of course when she actually leaves for the last time, she gets into the actual real Psycho, the car that she drove in Psycho. They even have a little bit of a sting of the same music. Of course, speaking to the cast, Jamie Lee Curtis performance in this film is absolutely great, especially that moment in the third act when she turns back, she sends the kids away and she turns back, she gets the axe and she goes after Michael. That moment, just, oh my god, every time I watch the movie, just instant chills. It's just great. You'll also pretty notably have the introduction, the first movie that Josh Hartnett ever did. And I have to say, I wouldn't say that he's super strong in this movie, but honestly for his first role, I thought he was pretty likable, and I do think that especially whenever he had a scene between Jamie Lee Curtis, I think there was a lot of really good chemistry there. Now, one of the big issues that a lot of people have with this movie, and a big issue that was had during the production of the film, was the actual mask itself. They originally made a mask, I believe was made by, of course, the great makeup effects company K&B Studios. It was maybe a quarter of the way or halfway through the production that the studio itself actually decided that they did not like the mask, and then another mask was commissioned by Stan Winston, which was a lot closer to the look of the mask in the previous movies. Problem is that there's a lot of the close-up shots in the movie where you can really see Michael's eyes, and I think for a lot of us, including myself, I think it was always great in those original movies where you couldn't see Michael's eyes, and I think that was a big part of what made him kind of a scary figure, the fact that you couldn't see his emotion, whereas again in some of the close-ups of this film you can see his eyes, which I think is unfortunate. Other than that, I honestly have no problems with the Stan Winston mask at all, and I think that it actually looks fine, but everybody's got kind of their own opinion on the mask. What's interesting is that they didn't have time to really go back and reshoot every single part with the K&B mask, so if you watch the movie and pay attention really closely, you can kind of point out when the K&B mask was used and when the Stan Winston mask was used. And in the opening scene, actually neither masks were used, and they actually used the mask from Halloween 6 for some reason. I mean, and why that was, I don't know. And then there's even on top of that one shot where the mask is actually CGI, which is just awful and terrible looking. And apparently the reason they had to do that was because that was I guess a close-up shot where they used the K&B mask and they didn't have time to reshoot it, so they just sort of did a digital thing with it. And I mean, it looks terrible, especially by today's standards, and a lot of people, again, will point at that and say that was terrible. But the thing is, it's that shot is literally like half a second or more. I mean, it's so quick. I honestly didn't even notice it until maybe the fourth or fifth time that I watched this movie. So, but it is pretty, terrible, terrible. But again, doesn't really affect the overall enjoyment of the film itself. When you watch the movie, you'll notice that a lot of the faraway shots, they didn't reshoot it. They just kind of left it as the K&B mask, while most of the close-up stuff was where they, had the Stan Winston mask. So personally, it doesn't bother me. I think, again, unless you're really looking for it, you're not really going to notice it. But some people seem to take a lot of issue with, the whole changing masks thing. So it was an unfortunate production issue, but ultimately, I think, personally, of the mask that I prefer, I would say the Stan Winston mask I think looked pretty great, except again when they would do the close-ups of the eyes and things. The ending of this movie ended in a pretty interesting way where, Jamie Lee Curtis essentially wanted this to be the final film of the franchise. Same thing with director Steve Miner. The plan was for this to be the end of the franchise. But at that time, they just, would not, Mustafa Akkad was very protective over the Michael Myers character, and they would not allow them to kill off Michael Myers. So the ending of the movie ended up ultimately having to be changed. Mention quickly that we are going to be going into spoiler territory, so if you haven't watched, if you're not caught up on the Halloween movies, if you're just watching Halloween movies for the first time and haven't seen H2O, maybe this is just fair warning that this is going to be spoiler territory. The ending of the film, of course, ends with Laurie taking over hostage of the ambulance and essentially driving it off of the cliff, where she then, of course, has that wonderful tender moment with Michael before she cuts his head off with the axe, and it kicks into the Halloween theme. An absolutely awesome ending that would have been a perfect ending to the franchise, but what a lot of people, including myself, were surprised to find out that they actually planned for the opening of what the following film, Halloween Resurrection, where we discovered that the person she killed was actually a paramedic that Michael had switched suits with. The thing is, when you watch H2O, there's absolutely no hint that it's not what we see and that it's not Michael. So it's kind of weird how they kind of, in a way, sabotage the next movie themselves. It's really interesting, when you hear about the behind the scenes of this. They made it in a way where you can watch this film and treat it as the last film of the franchise. And again, in a way, much like I said about the previous sequels, you can kind of treat Resurrection as the same thing, where in my headcanon, Halloween Resurrection was just a bad dream that Laurie had, where she worried that, oh, did I kill the wrong person? Where in my personal headcanon, and I know a lot of other people's, she did. So it's pretty unfortunate that they had to continue the franchise. I know a lot of people, including myself, wish that they would have stopped here. And me personally, I think this would have been a perfect ending. Overall, I think that Halloween H2O is a great movie, and to me, honestly, I think it is the most underrated of all the Halloween films. The one that I think that I don't see getting enough love, because I do think that it is a legitimately great sequel. For me, I think that it is, one of the best sequels of the franchise, and was a perfect, honestly, example of how to do a reboot correctly of a franchise. Keeping some of the old whilst also introducing a lot of new elements and making it for a modern era. I mean, to me, that overall is kind of the generalized example of how to do a reboot right, and I think this was really great. And obviously at this point in time, the Halloween timeline is all kinds of messed up and confusing. I can't imagine how daunting it must be to new fans of the franchise, but it's pretty confusing at this point. But in a way, it's kind of nice where everybody has their own opinions on which movies are their favorite and which is their personal headcanon. For me personally, for those of you wondering, for me, the definitive Halloween trilogy is Halloween, Halloween 2, and Halloween H2O. That to me is my headcanon. That's the official trilogy, and everything else is either a bad dream or completely a separate alternate timeline. In terms of, the movie's availability, it is, of course, the 25th anniversary, and we did just recently get a new 4K transfer, 4K Blu-ray transfer in this beautiful Steelbook edition, which is absolutely gorgeous. I absolutely could not resist getting it. If you are somebody who is a fan of this movie or hasn't watched it in a long time and is looking at getting it, I would absolutely highly recommend you get this beautiful 25th anniversary Steelbook. It absolutely looks great, and so I absolutely love it. I would absolutely recommend getting that Steelbook. It's a lovely edition. There you go, guys. That it was my thoughts on Halloween H2O 20 years later. Be sure to jump in the comments down below. Let me know what your thoughts are on Halloween H2O, and let me know what your favorite Halloween timeline is. And yeah, so until next time, be sure to consume as much entertainment as humanly possible, and happy Halloween.